You mentioned that for the development of the PEFCR, you are going to have some kind of representative product. And you mentioned an interesting word, a virtual product. Can you give a little explanation what is for you a virtual product? What is intended in the background? That's one question. And the second question is also, it's mentioned that there are going to be 3 PEFs for each category. And there is any condition in the background, like for example, one of the PEFs must be in a CME, or it must be in a big company, or it must be a certain specific kind of product? There is no condition, or there is any condition in the background? Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, Michele just mentioned he will supply the answer to the second one. On the virtual product, I mean, just think about the situation that you have a product category where the supply chains of different products falling into that category might be very different. So just the bill of materials is very different. Then of course anything which tries to be representative for the whole product category cannot be a real product of either the one supply chain following or the other one. So you have to make it up. That's what I meant with virtual or hypothetical or whatever you call it. It's not a real product then anymore. It can't be. You will not find it anywhere on the market.
There is a second part of the question. When it comes to the supporting studies, there will be no conditions in terms of are they going to be SMEs or big companies. Of course, ideally, I would like to see at least each time one SME doing the study, because we need to learn a lot about the cost for them and the challenges that we'll have to face in reality. But there will be no precondition on that. The information that will have to be provided already when applying is which will be the companies and the brand name of the product which will be tested. That is an information that we want to have since the very beginning. And it is important that the 3 studies are done by 3 different companies. So it cannot be that the same company will do 3 studies on 3 different products produced by them. It has to be competitors, let's say, doing the study.
Hello. Okay, hello? No, okay. My name is Hannah Schreiber from Environment Agency Austria. I'm interested in almost a similar question with a review process. Michele told us that the testing of verification will be paid by the Commission. And is it the same review process Rana told about with a PEFCR review with the 3, or is it a different stage of testing?
I think Rana mentioned that there are 2 different things. One is the review of the PEFCR, which is something that you always do also, for example, in EPD, where you have a review of documents just to check, as Rana said, that the document has been developed in line with the PEF requirements and with the requirements of the process. And that part of the review will probably not be supported by Commission funding. So it will be for the pilots led by industry, it will be industry who will have to identify the reviewers and then pay for that review. What the Commission will support is the verification study, which is the verification of the supporting study that I was just mentioning in my reply to Javier. That part, which is also going to cost more than the review, that one will be supported by Commission funding.
Thank you.
Ines Oehme from the Federal Environment Agency Germany. I have a question regarding the benchmark. So far, if an SCA has been done, you define a functional unit. For example, you take a TV and decide for a certain screen size. But if you use the benchmark for comparison for different products, then is the question if you have already ideas how you could scale the functional unit. For example, if we look at the energy label, there the energy efficiency class is calculated, taking into account the different screen sizes. So if the benchmark should be usable at the end for different products, I think this would be a crucial challenge to take it into account. And another question, if you think about, I think we have some companies or products where we have rather stable supply chains, and we have other products where supply chains for the same product types change. And it could be a question for sensibility analysis if you purchase one component then from another supplier, how much this affects the PEF, and if it could be stable then for longer time for the product, or if then adaptations would be necessary.
Maybe I take first the second question on the supply chain. I think one of the roles of the PEFCR is to determine where you need your specific data, so foreground data or primary data, however you call it, and where you can live with secondary data. And for me, for example, the situation of fast-moving supply chains is one where a product category has to think hard. Do we want to require to redo things every 3 years, every 2 years, every year if supplier changes? Or are those changes in the suppliers probably not affecting the overall result of my PEF study that much that I have to actually redo some? And the second question can be, well, if it is not that relevant a process, if I change the supplier or not, can I live with a kind of generic data, secondary data for those processes in any case? And then really I lose, of course, the specificity of my own supply chain, but I gain a lot in terms of simplicity, if I can do that. But it's up to the product categories to really look into detail. At what stage can I say, well, I really need only secondary data for that. I don't want to know the ins and outs of your supply chain on that one. If it's a major component, if it's linked to your major environmental inputs and pressures you put on the environment, you may have to live with it, yes. That you need to look into it.
In terms of benchmarking, as you know, there we are a front runner. So we really, I don't know where to turn my head and to look how the others are doing, because there is no others. So we will see how we will deal with that, because the same problem we will have with products where there are different technologies on the market, like television. And so how you define really the product category? It's just a single technology, or you're going to have a mix of the different technologies, but then again, there are different supply chain, different issues there. So these are the things that will be discussed at during the first meeting, the first physical meeting, when the scope will be agreed. In terms of supply chain, there are two comments I want to make there. The first one is that what I didn't put in my slide is which are the criteria against which we will select pilots, which I think is an important information. And the criteria, which will be in the documents that we will publish, I simply forgot to put in slides. The criteria will be things like the environmental relevance of that product, how much we can benefit from improving the environmental performance of that product group. It will be things like how willing is the industry to cooperate, how good are the secondary data which are there. But then there will be also other consideration, like we want to look at some long supply chain, we want to look at some short supply chain, we want to look at some very fast changing supply chain, and something where things are more stable in order to have a better picture. We want to look at products where SMEs have a dominant role in production. We want to look at products where are more the big players which are responsible. So there will be a kind of biodiversity of participants. The second comment is on the dynamic supply chain. Textile is one of those sectors which we know have a very dynamic supply chain. But at the same time, I'm quite optimistic, because in France, if I read correctly the report that has been published by those who have been participating in the pilots, textile sectors was enthusiastic about the approach and how they were able to manage that. So it seems that it's not technically impossible. I know I'm in very good collaboration with the Sustainable Upper Coalition, so we will discuss with them how we can overcome some problems, but it's not impossible. What I have more difficulties to understand how we will deal with that, and then maybe this is a question to Rana, is, okay, of course, when you are producing something and you buy your raw materials directly from the producer, it's okay. I mean, we know how to do the calculation, to check the environmental performance of that product. But a lot of commodities are not bought directly from the producers, but they are bought in markets here and there in the world. So how will we be able to assign an environmental performance to that commodity if we don't know where that commodity is coming from?
Thanks for that question, Michele. I think it. I think it will be, yeah, that's a good idea. I think it will be up to, again, the product category to see how they can identify a data source, for example, that commodities which you do not necessarily buy consistently from a specific supply chain, but somewhere on the market where you actually really may not know where it comes from. And I don't think it happens that rarely. So I think that will be a question again to decide for which parts can or even must secondary data be used, because you simply don't have access to the primary data.
So I've seen E, Christoph.
Guy Castellan, Plastic Europe. My question is about the benchmark. In my understanding, it's not applicable to raw materials and intermediates. Can you confirm that? Why? Because materials can be compared in the frame of a full LCA in an application, of course. You cannot compare materials as such. It doesn't make sense. It's just building blocks.
Are you saying that, for example, 1 ton of steel produced in Europe has the same environmental performance as 1 ton of steel produced somewhere else in the world?
Maybe not, but it doesn't make sense to compare. If the steels have different properties, maybe the one which is produced in a place where it's the inventories, it's more emitting, you will need more of this iron quality for a given application, or it will last for maybe 10 years more in the application in comparison to the others. It's a basic that when we are all the raw materials producers, when we provide environmental data, we always say it doesn't make sense to compare the performance of the data at the material level. Of course, you must compare that in a system of product, in an application, of course, because the properties are completely different, may be completely different. It's fundamental for me. I mean,
maybe I understand you correctly, Guy. What is not the intention, Michele, please jump on me if I get that wrong. What is not the intention is to then compare on a material level a kilogram of plastic versus a kilogram of steel versus a kilogram of glass. I think there we all agree from a life cycle functional perspective that does not make sense at all. However, within one category, if you take, for example, plastics only, or paper only, or steel only, there, of course, you can come to meaningful benchmarks.
That's the new game.
If you have, I mean, if you say it makes sense to try to group within one product category producers which have intermediates, doesn't need to be a material like plastics, or can be copper, can be anything metal, but can be as well chemical intermediates. If you say that makes sense on an intermediate level to tackle with a PEFCR, then within that group, of course, you can try to establish benchmarks, and you will figure out, well, maybe for the plastics industries, the variations are not that big, depending on where you source from, on how you process, whether you have integrated plants or non-integrated plants, I don't know. But you can still make that call that you say, well, on average, the average situation relevant for the European market will be like that. But still within the plastics industry, I have a range probably of processes and a range of different environmental burdens attached to it. So I can make a distinction within the plastics, or I can make a distinction within a certain group of chemicals. But not between plastic, 1 kilogram plastic, 1 kilogram steel, 1 kilogram aluminium. I think everybody agrees that at that point in time is not helpful.
We stay with this question because I see Christian behind, Mark, and then Javier. Michael also directly on this? But I would like to stay with this question for a while. Are you with the raw materials?
Not really.
So I think Jean-Christophe just after this mentioned 3 guys. If you stick to it, if you just open a new box, then we will go back to Jean-Christophe.
So Christian Krüger from BASF.
It's
I
a
can
chemical
just support
company.
him here because you have always to look on the whole life cycle. Yeah. The question is also how you define the product category rule for sure. Yeah. If you consider on the function, for example, if you want to insulate a house, yeah, then, for example, okay, you have to look also on the use phase. That's clear because there plays the music. Yeah. If you can exclude that, the use phase, then you can compare for sure on the material base. But the problem is also, take a steel. A steel and a steel is not always the same. The same a plastic and a plastic is not always the same. Just small additives can change the performance drastically. And then it has also an impact on the use phase. So you always have to look on the life cycle. Always. And the next thing is also the end of life makes it even more complicated. For plastics, for example, yeah, if you know the WEEE, when you include that and then you can recycle or not, that has a major influence on the whole life cycle impact assessment. So to define the benchmark here is very important how you define the product category rules and the confinement of that. And then after that, to my opinion, you can define which steps I make a benchmark. Probably you have to make it for the whole life cycle, not only on the material part.
Maybe just listen to Mark quickly. Is that exactly what you want to say? Okay. Wait for the mic, please. If you say exactly what he says, don't repeat it.
No, it's I work for the European insulation materials, and I totally agree with what BASF said. If we would make Christian, sorry,
it's not a company.
If we would make a PCR, it would be for all insulation materials. And if you make a benchmark, not looking to the whole life cycle assessment, the logical choice based on the benchmark would be to have very thin insulation with a very bad lambda value, and you would very badly insulate your houses. So the benchmark could only be made on insulation materials with exactly the same characteristics, which will be, you will have that many benchmarks only for insulation materials that I don't be sure that it will be usable anymore.
I think we let Michele and Rana reply, and then we jump to the next question. Jean-Christophe.
Yeah, this is a typical case where we don't disagree with what you're saying, but we simply, it's not black and white. We think then it all depends how you define the functional unit. And in the functional unit, it's not just about a kilogram of steel. In the functional unit, you're also defining how well it is providing a certain function for how long, how much time. So there are, we list 5 characteristics that shall be included in how you define the functional unit. So once you agree on what is the functional unit, then you can have a benchmarking. And I don't see this only for final use. This is also possible for products, for intermediate. We had a very preliminary PEFCR process development for the paper sectors, which was also mentioned by one of the speakers. It was not the full process, it was just looking at a certain part of the process. But there we were working at intermediate level, and the paper industry agreed that it was possible to do that. I mean, you can produce a roll of paper, and the performance characteristics will change based on the industry who is producing, based on the production process where they are sourcing the wood and things like that. So it's not impossible. The key thing is how well you define the I mean, you have to be very clear and transparent on what the benchmarking refers to. So what is in the functional unit?
I think that was clear. Jean-Christophe?
Yes, Jean-Christophe Bligny from Danone. I have several questions. One is about the EC support. Maybe I missed the point, but you mentioned that you will provide tools for the support of the users. So I would like to know what's about. You mentioned in the EF help desk that you will have a data center, and I would like also know more about that. I have also a reflection regarding what we spoke about
just now. It was about the identification of benchmark, and I think I would like to point out that it's really relevant to insist in the PEFCR to mention the uncertainty and the significant or insignificant data or result, because it's really key for the robustness, for the credibility of that, and I think it's something that must be mandatory as a expression of the result itself. Because is it possible to compare with 30% of uncertainty or something like that? So I think it's really key. And I have one last question is about the vision for you about the coordination of PEFCR. How will you imagine to manage all the different existing PCR, and what will be the next step for you on this kind of coordination organization for management of PCR?
Okay, let's start. As I'm not taking notes, so if I forget something, please remind me. What are we doing for the SMEs? The thing we have in mind, we haven't published yet the tender, but it is an advanced stage of preparation. What we want to let me start from another angle. I've seen softwares developed by different companies and also associations who basically are helping the SMEs to fill in the data that are required for certain application, which have the kind of the model in the background, so they only have to fill in the things that are relevant for them without doing calculation, then using the information either for improving their process or for simply passing the information to someone else in the supply chain. We like that concept because we think it's one of the right things to do in order to make life of SMEs simpler. So what we are probably going to ask to some external companies is to, starting from the PEFCR that will be developed, to translate those PEFCR into software modules, so that the companies which are in that supply chain will be able to use this user-friendly interface to be compliant with the PEFCR, introducing only their primary data and not needing to do anything else. So they will not need any LCA expertise. They will only be asked, for your process, you're in this part of the supply chain, introduce this data according to these guidelines, and then that information then will pass to the next user. So we want to have a new proof of this concept, which we know is already technically feasible because I've seen these things working. We want to help the strengthening this concept, so that if that works, this software, which will be open source, will be then used by the applicants and replicated for all the other PEFCR. So it's a proof of concept. Data center, probably it's misleading what I put there. It's not a data center, it's a data manager. In the sense that, as I said, all the confidential information will only be sent to the technical help desk, who will use that during the PEF screening to define the preliminary benchmark, and after, when analyzing the supporting studies, again to fine-tune the calculation and the benchmarking. So they will be the only one to have access to confidential data. That's the meaning of that data center, is data manager. I think your third question was which are our future plans for PCR? Was that? In the document on the development of the PCR for the pilots, you will realize that we used as much as possible the approach developed in the United States PCR guidance, where myself but also Rana had the chance to contribute. So these two documents already represents an attempt to streamline the process for the different program operators. And what we are saying there is, whenever there is already an existing PCR or a similar document, that will be the starting point for the European PEFCR. So the people in the technical secretariat will have to make an analysis and see to what extent that is already usable, and to what extent, which are the things that have to be changed. That analysis will be discussed with the stakeholders to find an agreement, and then the work will focus only on those parts that need to be adapted. Because we don't want to lose all the knowledge that has already been created. I mean, there are hundreds of PCR. Most of them are variable. There is a lot of good work that the construction sector is doing on EPD and other products. So we want to build on that. And that's why we have identified, following the lines of the PCR guidance, the process to align the existing PCR to the future footprint category rules. This harmonization work will be overlooked during the pilot by the steering committee. What will happen after the pilot, of course, is not something that I can tell you now. It will depend on what will be the future policies. In any case, there will be some need of an organism or an institution controlling that the kids are playing in the right way. If it's going to be a private or a public or mixed, I mean, it's too early to define that.
Then I've seen, we stay with France, so there's Sylvain, and maybe keep your hands up for, I've seen Thierry, Rasmus, Javier, you're out of speaking time pretty soon, but you have another one, maybe you... Then there's Michael, there's Moritz, wow, the last row, Stefan, Baha, Frank, David. Okay, I think I might have to ask you again, I will not remember all of this. So we finish this side and then we move here. Sylvain.
Yes, Sylvain Chevassu from the French Sustainable Development Ministry. I would like to confirm what Michele said, that indeed the textile sector has been among the most proactive ones in the French national experiment, is still very active in the working group as well. I think we can say that they demonstrated the feasibility of product environmental footprinting and consumer information through the pilot, but they also reported specific challenges such as complex supply chains, a high number of products and a high turnover of products, different seasons, data issues. But I'm sure Eric from H&M will tell us more later on. And among the most interesting projects in the pilot that we had in France were SMEs, and they represented actually 1/3 of the projects. SMEs in this pilot were very motivated, very creative. I think they see the environment as new opportunities to try to differentiate their products on the market when it's more difficult maybe for them to differentiate on costs. I was wondering if SMEs will be able to lead projects in the European experimentation. I find that the governance system of your experimentation looks very good. But you are also asking quite a lot from project leaders, and I was wondering about the feasibility for SMEs to lead projects in the European experiment.
To be honest, I hardly see an SME leading one of those pilots because the work to be done will be a lot. Maybe if there is the involvement of the European Association of SME, then they might take the lead. But also historically, I've seen how they can contribute to the eco-design development, to the eco-label, to the GPP. They have never really been in the position to be in the leadership. They already are struggling to contribute like NGOs because they have extremely limited resources and their action is spread over so many different issues that I don't expect. I would be positively surprised if some SMEs will propose, but I don't think that's coming.
Thierry? Or Terry?
Terry Thiel with the Lubrizol Corporation, and we're another chemical company. Two questions. One, and it's perhaps the flip of the steel question, where on a particular product, the intermediates may come from multiple sources. So a given finished product manufacturer may, one batch, have resourced an additive from France, the next batch, the exact same additive, but it comes from Texas. And so the footprint of the manufacturing is very different, and it's going to simply depend upon day to day where the next batch came from the supplier. So there is no standard format for a given manufacturer of what the profile is going to look like. They may get their intermediates from a range of different suppliers from different sources who have the same profile from a performance standpoint, but their underlying manufacturing is different. So how would you anticipate that would be addressed? And then the second question I have is, one of the key issues for any company, any producer, is to constantly innovate. So there's constantly going to be change and improvement in, and I may change the formula in a shampoo or a detergent or an engine oil, and this will be a constant iteration. And what is the expectation in terms of, if you will, I've now gone through the process and I've footprinted my product, but I've now changed something in it, either as a cost reduction or as a performance improvement. Am I expected to constantly have to refresh that footprint every single time I make a change to the product?
Maybe I try to answer the first one first. On the supply chain issues, if you have a supply chain which is, or can change at least on a kind of daily basis for batches or weekly basis, I think the one approach to do is, of course, to say, okay, then I look at the average situation over a specific time period, a year, and say, over the year I get 50 batches out from there, 70 out from there, and 100 out from there. That is the one approach. The other one approach, which I hope at least as well will be one of the learnings, is, well, if you look into the different ways you source your chemicals in that case, maybe you have a learning as well on, right, if I source it all year from a specific supplier and takes a specific chain, maybe my footprint significantly improves or deteriorates, which I think can be an important learning as well. Because let's not forget, the whole exercise is there at the end of the day, not to have a result you can show somewhere, but the end objective is to reduce the environmental impacts. And if one of the results, not only in the pilots, but as well later on, hopefully, will be that you learn that much over your supply chain, that you can say, well, I know if I source it more from that supplier, I actually will gain significantly, if that's the case, on the environmental side. Maybe in future that as well determines your decision making on the suppliers. So it is something as well from the process, which offers a learning in the whole process on getting really a detailed knowledge on those issues within your supply chain. Again, from the perspective of how to deal with it for the footprinting, one thing is to look at it, does it have a significant different impact on the total result? If not, it's not that relevant. And can I build meaningful averages into the whole system where I say, well, I'm not interested in my daily operations, I'm interested in the yearly result, if that makes sense.
But just to clarify, I mean, if I were to average over a year, assuming that pattern stayed the same, to the point you made about one being preferred over the other, if I've averaged it, I've taken that away.
If I can comment on the question, this is also interesting because it gives you the flavor of where some people might start to cheat. Because if you have 3 different suppliers and one have much better performance from the environmental point of view compared to the other, someone might be tempted to use only that one in your declaration of performances, because then your product will look much better than on average it is. And that's why I was insisting so much that one essential element of the verification will be the traceability of information, so that when the accountancy will be done, we are sure that we can trace back where the different batches come from, and if we are using correctly in the definition of the average, if we will be using the average. At the same time, if you decide to communicate through alternative system, which is not a label, which is difficult to change from a product to product, if you use QR codes, then you always link the barcode. You know exactly which barcode corresponds to what badge. So in that case, I mean, the new IT system might allow more flexibility in terms of information and providing the correct information for different badges. So that is also something that might come.
On your second part of the question, if I remember correctly, it is about how often do you have to update. I think there we have to find a solution similar to, I think is as well in eco-labels and as well in EPDs, that you have to check if you have significant changes throughout your whole supply chain, which would significantly alter the final result. So not 10% in the suppliers make probably no difference if you look at the final product. But if the final product shifts of, I think in EPDs it's very often 10%, I think, then you at least need to recalculate. Whether you then need to redo the whole thing is a question of whether these changes are confirmed as significant, let's say larger than 10% on the final result. But we must have a kind of check that it cannot be that apart from, let's say, deviations which happen in the supply chain which do not impact the final result, that you can have an outdated declaration based on a PEF where it has no relation to the product you sell anymore. That cannot be. So there must be some kind of, not best buy date, but when you have significant changes in your supply chain which would alter the final result by a certain percentage, then you would have to at least redo the calculations and then think about whether you have to redo the communication as well. And of course that will depend, sorry Michele, it will depend very much in which context you use that kind of information. So if it is used in a policy instrument context, I'm sure that the policy instrument will tell you how long this kind of declaration can be used.
Of course, bear in mind that we're looking at this from a life cycle standpoint. So if I'm changing my chemistry, not only the performance of the chemistry and its formulation, but its source, how do I know that I've hit that threshold without going through the entire life cycle process? It's not like an EPD. It's not like an energy where I'm only measuring one piece. I'm looking at the entire life cycle. So if at the end of the day, whatever that, and I don't quite know how to get at that 10% if you're looking at multiple impacts. So is it 3% of one impact and 4% of another impact and 7% of another impact, and that is more than 10%? How do I know I've hit that level of materiality until I do the entire life cycle evaluation of that chemistry?
I think you have the possibility to do some what I would call screening or checking. I mean, if I know I have a completely new ingredient to a significant level in my product, whatever, a new chemical which I haven't looked at before, then I can of course make a worst case estimate and say, well, what of the chemicals I'm using today has the highest profile, and if I would assume that is whatever 10% of a new ingredient I have, then I can make an estimation, can it have a significant impact? If I'm not sure that it has not, then you're right, you probably need to look deeper. But I think, to be honest, you can screen out a lot of the minor deviations and formulations especially by assuming, well, if I really have something I know already and I increase it by a bit, I can calculate it very easy. If I do not know what it is, what would be my worst case assumption on what is the stuff I'm using at the moment, chemically similar, and then I can make an estimate. And if the estimate is not clear, I agree you would have to do a bit of more work and look into could it a significant change.
Okay, I think we leave it here. Michael, please put the question that might be relevant to everybody here. If it's really only for you relevant, then maybe we do this in the coffee break.
Well, come on. Okay. I have 3 questions, some of them very simple to answer. I mean, we haven't talked about weighting so far. I heard that you can reduce the number of impact categories. I'm also interested in, because when we see pictures of a label, it reminds me more on weighting rather than on having a selection of known impact categories, as you mentioned them in the drafts. That's one question. The other question goes to the data center, maybe we talk about that later, but it's also about, is it also looking at the inventories? Because the inventories can be quite complex. I mean, it's not a carbon inventory what we're talking about toxicity, and I know different industries have some concern about impact categories, so this is maybe also a major task. Maybe just if you can give a brief statement, not about details, but how you would think how much time or effort would that cost to get correct inventories from all the companies, because it's not an easy task to provide that information, from my understanding. So no details here, but just a kind of estimate how you would see that, how resource intense is that. And I'm still not really understand how to really apply as a company or as a consortium and selecting a product group or product category that is really appropriate. Is that part of when I apply that I define it in a way that I convince you? Maybe if that's the case, because it's a very tricky part to do that, because you're saying you shouldn't be too broad, but you shouldn't be too narrow. So is that part of when I apply to make that in a clever way that this is really matching the expectations you have? So that's my last question.
The last part.
And my last remark, maybe to Mark. I very much like your presentation, and I think harmonization is important, but harmonization also can hinder some development. I think you have to find the balance here, and maybe also you have to rethink how you draw the arrows at the moment, because I've been involved in harmonization of truck CO2 regulation, and I don't know how sensitive that issues can be being on different markets. So maybe it's a good way to start very easy and just figure out what are the parts that can be globally answered and what are the parts that can be regionalized or locally, because it's, you mentioned stakeholders
Okay, thank you.
are very particular in different markets. Okay.
Let's focus on his main part, the pilot selection.
How to be clever in proposing.
Yes, that's probably relevant to all of us.
What you will be asked in the application package is to identify the product category you have in mind, to describe it in terms of NACE codes, to provide at least a preliminary market analysis where you explain how the market is distributed in Europe, who are the big players, what's their yearly turnover for that product groups, and to mention the product brands that will be tested during the supporting study. So you have to be quite detailed in the definition. You cannot be too vague, because then you will be missed too many elements for the decision. Now, how specific you want to be, that's again, it's not something that I can tell you. It really depends who are the people that you will have in the technical secretariat. If they're already PCR that you want to use, you want to maybe tailor your proposal around the existing documents so that you can have less costs and be more faster in terms of development. These are the things that belongs more to the business model that you have in mind for your own product, than not something that the Commission has a specific desire or wish. We will evaluate the pilots, as I said, on all those lists, but of course, the more information will be provided, or the clearer information will be provided in the application, the easier will be for us to decide which are the pilots which can deliver the best results. And only the last thing I want to say, we are not going to be full on ourselves. We are not going to select only the pilots where we will be sure that we will get positive results, because that will be kind of cheating. I can ensure that we will also choose pilots where we expect a failure, because we have seen during the first wave of pilots, we have learned much more from the failures than from the good ones.
It's only the mistakes that make us richer. So we will switch to this side, especially to people who we haven't heard at all. So I've seen a hand from Stefan, and then we do Bahar, and then it's Marianne. There's Frank. Yeah, that's Bahar.
It's Stefan Schaller from GS1 Germany. Today and also yesterday we talked a lot about the possibility to narrow down the impact categories to 3 to 4. Is there any reference to this information? Because I must have overread it in the guide. It's not, I couldn't find it in the guide. Will it come up in a different reference document? So where is this fixed? Where can I read about this? This would be a first question. The second one is, Michele said something about the ways of the 4 different types of communication. After discussion yesterday, I had the feeling that it goes a little bit to the direction to maybe a little bit similar to the energy label, so that we talked about the 60% yesterday in the middle, that we need to move in different categories, and we know that it has to be some kind of category approach, because otherwise you get into like calculation trouble. You don't want to go to 2-digit after commas. Wouldn't it be interesting to have for all the pilots a kind of similar communication means where you give a clear methodology to all of them and see how they cope with it, how they fill this with meaning, just to have a comparison in the end? I think it would be quite interesting. And the last question, we have seen many initiatives, TSC, REP, Product Sustainability Forum, which are driven by retailers a lot. So what will be the role of retailers in this? Because so far we are talking about industry only.
How you will select the 3-4 most relevant impact categories is not described in the PEF and OEF methodology, because, as Rana is proud to remind me, it is not part of the methods themselves. That's normalization in weighting, basically. What you will use to identify the most relevant impact categories. And that will be slightly more explained in the guidance document, in the sense that in the guidance document we will provide the normalization factors to be used, which will be based on a European consumption model that JRC is finalizing. So these factors will be available by December this year. You will not find them now in the guide, but by the time you will have to use them in the pilot, these factors will be available. And as far as the weighting is concerned, the starting point is that there is no agreement whatsoever in Europe or in the world about a weighting system. So what we are saying the baseline weighting system you will have to use in all pilots is the equal weighting, so 1 to all. At the same time, if piloters would like to test a different weighting system, they will be allowed to, provided that they also use the all weighting system, the same weighting system, so that we can have some comparison of the results that different weighting system will lead to. And as I said yesterday, in a parallel way, we will also set up a process that will be launched at the European level on how to define, how to get to a European weighting system. So these three things will work together. And of course, I forgot the other questions. Can you show? Retailer, yes. Retailers have been very pushing also on our side in saying, please go ahead, we won't do that. We want to do things. I mean, the French Association of Retailers were the only ones who, in a position paper, a formal one, asked for a mandatory system, which when I read was kind of shocking, because no one asked me ever a mandatory system. They were. So there is a lot of interest there. And as you will learn later today, some specific retailers are also working already, apart from Walmart and all the others in Sustainability Consortium, developing innovative ideas. You will hear from Colruyt, for example, later. So from the Commission perspective, we are strongly interested in having PEF and OEF, especially OEF, could be quite challenging and interesting for retailers. We hope they will propose. If they will not propose, we might decide to go in any case for an OEF for retailer sectors, because there is a strong interest in that. And then we are, of course, working with the Sustainability Consortium, so we will see also what comes on that side. And then retailers will be involved in the communication part, because as I said, the communication part will be about testing communication vehicles. Why we don't want to pre-assign the communication vehicles? Because we expect that industry will tell us what works for the different product groups, and they might be different way of working. I mean, different product groups might require different way of channeling the communication. But at the end of the day, if you look at all the different means, at the end of the day, as I say, there are 4 or 5. So when I'm asking them to indicate 3 or 4, more or less everything will be included there.
Thank you.
My name is Bahar Chad-Krause from GS1 Germany, where most of my questions are answered now, but maybe 2 other short questions. Is it planned to make the PEFCRs publicly available after the pilot phase? And the second one is, are you going to provide a database to show high data quality also for SMEs, maybe, to assure good PEF studies?
PEFCR will be publicly available, yes, for sure. Also during the development process, all the different drafts will be publicly available. In terms of databases, there is no plan from the Commission to set up a database for this. We are working, and JRC is working on the ELCD database, which is a free public access, which should be in line with our requirements sooner or later. It's still not, but I mean, they're working on that. But again, as I said yesterday, after the pilot, we will have to identify a solution to provide secondary data for free to the users, if we want to use that in policymaking. How we are going to do that, I mean, we have some ideas in mind, but nothing has been decided. But that is in Latin they say a conditio sine qua non to go the step further. So if we don't solve that, we will never be able to use it in any kind of policy.
Thank you. Then Marianne. We work now from the back too. I think we do another 7-8 minutes. Are you okay for this? Otherwise, if you just don't want to follow this session, you could leave and have a coffee. It's not, nobody has to be forced to stay in this room. Everyone apart from the panelists with me here. Or should I answer the questions then? I can do. I can probably do that.
Thank you. It's just a very short question. My name is Marianne Jusche and I'm a consultant and I work with some small and medium enterprises. And I understood that it will be quite a lot of work to participate in the pilot, one of these pilots, and you also guessed that probably no SME will be a leader in one of those projects, but the smaller ones then can participate somehow. The big ones have to invite the other ones. That's what I understood. Is there any, is it defined in which way the others will can participate then? Do they can they just like say what they think, or do they have to? Can they make decisions also? Is there any the way it will work?
Yeah. In terms of participation, what will happen once the pilots are selected? All this information will be reported on the website, and the people who are interested in being involved in the work without being in the leadership will be able to send their expression of interest, so they will be added automatically to the different mailing lists that we will have, so that they gather all the information. In terms of contribution to the discussion, as I said, most of the things will happen through a web commenting tool. So we have divided the work in chapters, and as soon as a certain chapter is ready in draft, it will be put on the web, and the commenting period on that chapter will start, so that people will be able to provide all kind of feedback, supporting documents, data related to that chapter. And then there will be the 2 physical meetings where things will be discussed at the beginning, at the end. Of course, there will be in the physical meeting, there will be no formal decision vote, so it will not be the plenary of stakeholders who will express any vote, but of course there will be, we will try to identify to what extent the final results is kind of unofficially endorsed by those who have been developed it, and then the final decision will be taken by the steering committee, who will overlook the entire process. So that's how the SMEs will be able to contribute without being in the leadership. Of course, they can be part of the leading partners. What I was saying, just to be clear, that I don't see them as being the project coordinator, which is the one who will have to do most of the work. But of course, they can be in the driving seat. They can be one of the companies testing one of the PEFCR and things like that.
Okay, in the last row there was Frank. Then we have David, Moritz, Michael. Who was?
Thank you. It's Frank from One World Sync. I was just wondering, because Stefan asked about the retailers' engagement in that project. Is that some sort of engagement above the governance, or is that involvement in the pilot project? Because when we talk about communication, we have different points of view. Some demand like a mandatory solution, the others have like a more voluntary point of view. So how does the Commission or the whole PEF tries to engage the retailers then?
if there will be a pilot on retailer sectors, they will have the same rights as all the other pilots to have a seat in the steering committee. If there will be no pilot on retailers, then they will not be directly involved in the governance structure as such, but they will be involved in the pilot-specific phase, as I said, the communication one. And there we want also to work in collaboration with the Retailer Forum, which is another organism or mechanism that we have at European level where all the major retailers are sitting.
Thank you. David?
David Bellamy, UK Food and Drink Federation. Question for Michele. Two quick questions. First, does the Commission have a plan B if you don't get sufficient volunteers for certain product categories, or you don't get any volunteers? And my second question is the food and drink. Obviously, the decision to defer food and drink pilots until next year. I fully understand the reasons behind that. Does that also include packaging that would be used for food and drink products, which you could argue is within the system boundary of food and drink?
The plan B, if we don't get enough applicants, is that I will go on holiday. Sorry, I vote for that. Finally. Well, honestly, I don't expect that scenario. You know, my favorite plan was not to adopt this because then my life would have been easier. No, I really don't expect that scenario happening because we have been really flooded with the expression of interest by different companies and associations. So I will have rather the other problem to select and then disappoint people who will not be selected. I mean, in case it happens, we still have 6 pilots that will be led by the Commission, so then we will have to carefully select 6 sectors. But again, I don't see that coming. The question on packaging is extremely interesting because I myself didn't think yet about that. It could fit under the work of the food roundtable. It could not. So this is something that probably if we will have an application from packaging producers, and again, it cannot be material it cannot be only paper packaging. If we talk about beverage containers, it has to be aluminium, paper, plastics all together. If we will get that application, I think before taking a decision, we will have to consult with the people in the food roundtable, or maybe we will do this consultation even before, so that we have a common understanding, a common decision will be taken on that. I don't know if Jean-Christophe, you want already to say something on that.
Moritz? Oops. Moritz.
We have talked a lot and discussed a lot about the PEF. What about the OEF? From my perspective, OEF is quite different in terms of methodology, in terms of who is interested in that information. It's rather a strategic issue. It's rather a communication tools for investors. What are your perspectives on that in the pilot? Could you also give some indications what were the results from the first pilot for the OEF? Because I took part in the GHG Scope 3 protocol pilot, and there we found out that many companies had big problems in proving the completeness for GHG emissions. And for the complete OEF, it will be probably even harder. So if you could give some indications on that.
Yes, maybe I answer the more technical part. It's right, the OEF of course has a different approach from a product approach. In parts it's actually easier because you don't have to go down to the product level, so you can, for your organization, if you know what you are doing, what you're producing and providing to the market, you have some easier approaches than building up your profile by doing lots of PEFs on the products you sell on the market. You don't need to do that. You can have a more top-down approach, which should make your life much easier in terms of your own operations. And there where the easiness ends. And I agree. And that is as well what we figured out in the past pilots, where I would say the success rate of completing a pilot according to the OEF guidelines, I think was lower than compared to the product side. I think that's fair to say. What we had nevertheless as learnings is that, well, if you have that approach of going over your product portfolio, you still can with generic data, not necessarily with data from your own chain, from your own supply chain. Go into the secondary data and use that for your OEF. What I think most companies as well really struggled with in parts, depending on what they provided to the market, is what is with use, what is with end of life, where they, in many cases, had really a hard time to figure out how to deal with that. And that is why, in contrast to the product environmental footprint, where we are relatively harsh on the requirement to have a full life cycle approach, meaning from cradle to grave, if possible. For intermediates, that will not be possible. On the organization side, it really has a little bit more opening to look only into the partial life cycle, so really to have more up to your gate. Although we do not desire that, and for some things it will not be suitable, but it is a possibility. So basically to exclude use and end of life, if that is an extreme case. And on the other hand, of course, it's a possibility to reduce your organization to a part of the organization. So for diverse organizations, for example, they would have a very hard time to do an organization footprint of everything they do. So they could focus on certain business sectors, for example. That's a second possibility to simplify. But as Michele mentioned already yesterday, I think we are all aware that with the OEF, we are really entering an area where not so many people have been before. And the greenhouse gas protocol, Scope 3, I know that they struggled as well in some areas. However, it's as well interesting to find that, well, very often for many companies participating in the greenhouse gas Scope 3 exercise, it was 60, 70, 80% of the greenhouse gas impacts came from the Scope 3. So it made as well the point to say, well, also as an organization, it is very important not only to know what you're doing inside, but as well to know what happens before your gate and what happens after your gate. Because that, in many cases, determines your overall impact on the environment. So it showed both, basically. It showed the complexity of it, and it showed the relevance. And what we try to do is to look at the relevance and say, yes, you should do it, and then try to provide meaningful helps and guides and try to simplify where you can. But I think we agree that on the OEF side, it is more open on how basically things will evolve. The plan so far is that we have 3 pilots on the product side and 3 pilots on the organization side. So that not a clear preference from our side on where to focus on in the pilots. Of course, if we get 99% on the product side and only 1% on the organization side applications, we will have to see.
As Mark was in the help desk, I would like to hear also your opinion on these difficulties with OEF.
Yeah, and indeed, there were not too many who made an OEF, and when we analyzed the results, they didn't even follow the guidelines very much. So it was, I'm not sure if I may say this, but it was interesting that some companies try to do the whole OEF and even the PEF alone without a consultant, and usually they were not able to deliver a final report. Others used a consultant, but unfortunately, many of the consultants did it the way they have always done it. So there will be an issue now for the new roundtable to see whether there are companies able to do it alone, what they will come up with, whether the guidance is clear enough, and whether the consultants they hire will actually follow the guidelines and not rely on their experience and do it the way they were always used to do it. It was interesting to evaluate that.
Thank you. There's Michael, Jim, Amelie. Did you raise your hand? You have a question? Soft. Excellent. Michael.
So I have 2 questions, one for Michele and one for Rana. The one for Michele is, what about if existing PCR, like for example in French or all available PCR on JetNet or Environement, decide to revise it and to be confirmed with the PEF, which I think will not take so much work to be conformed with the PEF, and then they decide, okay, now we have plenty of available PCR within one year available. Will it go through the steering committee or will it be coordinated, such thing?
I think the right way to approach this should be they should join the pilot, do this alignment exercise within the rules of the pilot so that the process of alignment can be confirmed by our governance structures, and when it is confirmed, they can start replicating it internally for all the other PCR.
But you will limit it to 20?
It is, I mean, they have to test the alignment process. You don't need to do that for 100 PCR. Once you verify that the way to align an EPD and a GEDNet PCR to an EF PEFCR has certain step, and that way of doing it is approved by the steering committee as being compliant, then you can replicate the process internally for all the others. You don't need to put all of them through the testing process.
Thank you. And for Rana, one added value from the PCR developed in France was the classification of data into specific, semi-specific, and generic data. And I think you keep this because you ask to identify specific and generic data. But another added value to simplify the work for SME was to provide default value for semi-specific data, conservative default value they can use if they don't have access to data. And the idea was to create a kind of virtual circle, because maybe later on people will replace those worst case scenario value by other ones. And I don't think you keep this approach.
At the moment we have it not explicitly in, of course, in this what I call the iterative data gathering process. Of course the feedback from the stakeholders will be a major input. And of course if we get the feedback, well, I mean, maybe you can distinguish it between activity data, so what does an SME do on their side, and do they have a knowledge about that? And how much of that can they put in, for example, into a kind of data facilitating, data gathering tool, and how much of that then still has to be linked to some kind of generic data sets in behind. So if you know, for example, I use so much energy or so much time on a specific process line, then I can figure out what machine do I have, how much electricity do I use on that process line. That does not tell me which emissions that have, of course. So there might be a mix between the activity data of SMEs, which is easier to collect, so what do you do actually on your site in the processes, and linking that to generic, let's say, life cycle modules, which give you then really the emission profile of that activity, although that never ever was measured at the SME level, and it would make no sense either. And there, I think there's several options where you can simplify in dividing what an SME actually has together, what kind of data, and what kind of data will have to be supplied by some kind of generic data in the background.
Thank you. We have the last three questions. That's Jim, Mark, and Rasmus. Let's see.
Thank you. Jim Bracken, GS1 Global Office. David mentioned packaging, and you may be aware, or maybe you're not aware, that we've just almost finished now the standardization of the consumer goods requirements for packaging, called the GPPS, the Global Packaging Protocol. That would actually contain something like 30 attributes. So by summer, by June, we'll actually have available the necessary attributes for packaging sustainability, and would be a great example to do a test on. We were planning to do pilots anyway, but this would be a perfect pilot, and it would contain everything, whether it's plastic, aluminium, paper, etc. Okay.
You see a big nodding here, so maybe you have to write something down. That was Mark here in front.
Thank you. So Mark Didde, the BBCSD. I have a question for Michele, a very quick one. About the communication slide that you showed earlier in your presentation, you mentioned for the OEF that there would be two reports, an OEF external communication report and an OEF performance tracking report. The reality today is that most companies report their environmental performance in sustainability reports or in integrated reports, and WBCSD is working with the Integrated Reporting Council and other stakeholders to further mainstream and harmonize integrated reporting. So my question is, if a company already reports the relevant information in their sustainability or integrated report, is that from an European Commission perspective then a check mark that it's okay, or do you still expect them to provide these two additional reports, the external communication report and the performance tracking report?
it is not about how you name the report. It is about what information you introduce in the report and how solid, verifiable, and transparent the information is. That's all it's all about. If the way you will report it is in line with the requirements that we have, you don't need to change your reporting. If it is not, as it unfortunately is often in CSR, where basically people can report whatever they want, however they want, without any guideline, that is the situation we are trying to correct.
Maybe quickly following, are you then also engaging with the Integrated Reporting Council, who is bringing all this together to have one harmonized reporting framework for companies?
I think that will be a bit too premature now, because we still have to identify how far we can go with reporting. That will be the next step after the pilot. There are already some discussion, because as you know, there was at Commission level a discussion on non-financial reporting, or a revision of the scheme for non-financial reporting, where already the OEF has been mentioned as one example. So in the next revision cycle, we'll probably get deeper into the discussion, see how far we can go towards a single reporting scheme.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rasmus?
It's PCF World Forum.
PEF,
PEF, soon to be PEF World Forum. Thank you, yes. To apply for the upcoming pilot phase requires a lot of commitment. Yeah, it's more Michele. Requires a lot of commitment, actually financial support by the participating companies and stakeholders. So whoever is applying will have to collect that, bring up a lot of energy by participating companies, stakeholders, NGOs, whoever is involved. And you already mentioned that probably there will be many more applications than once being selected. So probably quite likely that some groups of stakeholders that want to participate and are not selected will want to do something on the PEF to explore this concept further, as they see this to be important. So what do you foresee for them to do? I mean, you could probably not hinder anyone from doing something, but how can this be like a constructive forward-moving energy for the whole process?
Give me money. I mean, our problem is resources. If I had more resources, I might allow more pilots, and we are working under constrained resources scenario. And I cannot say, okay, all those will not be selected, just do a shadow pilot according to the same rules, and then we will evaluate your results. That, even if I would like to be able to promise that would not fit with the, I would say, the reliability of the process that we are setting up. The evaluation will be based on the things that we can monitor, at least, if not control. So the only, I hope that we will be able, by having an oversubscription of companies, we will not be able to select them now, but that will send a very strong signal to policymakers in Brussels and in the different capitals around Europe that there is a demand from industry and from NGOs. And maybe they might consider, based on that demand, to increase the budget for this kind of activity, so that we can soon open a new call and allow more pilots to fed in the process. From my policy perspective, that's the only thing I can honestly envisage. I cannot see a shadowing exercise.
But maybe to stay with us, Michele, as Rasmus said, there's a lot of activity needed, and especially financial commitment. If you're in a company or even in an association, you would need the commitment to stay on board for 2 years. So that means clear resources, and you have a budget by the day you apply. And this budget could be bigger. So do you give out a price for still under... because in the end, if you say the only constraint is money, then maybe that could be included in budgeting the whole process anyway, because the budget for all the rest external is probably much higher than what would need it to internally be part of. I mean, basically your cost could be added, theoretically, or not.
No, it doesn't work. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. No.
Okay, well, I think we have to fix this. If it's really short, Hannah? It's just a yes or no answer. Good.
Yes.
Javier, is it short? Yes or no answer? No comment? Good. Hannah. Quick mic. Faster. Faster. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Is it possible to suppose for two different ideas? Because we have two ideas, one for the OEF and one for the PEF in the pipeline.
Yes.
Great.
Javier?
How can I say no to this?
Javier Castro. Michele, you mentioned that the costs, you have an idea of cost, but you don't have exactly the decimal after the comma. My question is the comma for the million amount or for the 100,000 amount?
It's a nice, simple question.
Well, I've done my own investigation. Talking to these people, we are very expensive, so just forget about them. Talking to people who are more reasonable in terms of costs. I would say that if you start from scratch, so if you don't have already PCR developed or other studies, the part related to the development of the PEFCR, so excluding the supporting study and excluding the communication activities, so only the first pillar of the pilot, might roughly cost around, I would say, a range between 50 and 80,000 euro if you start from scratch. Then there are, of course, economy of scale based on available information and knowledge. But that is my rough evaluation for the first pillar of the pilot.
Thank you. Jean-Christophe as the last comment.
Yeah, a question maybe to Rana, maybe more technical. It's about the fact that in the last version of the PEF, you are not using the last updating methodology. And as you know, for example, in the Environement protocol, we are using not Frickness methodology, but Pfister. And I would like to know how you will manage this kind of deviation, because I think that even by 2014, in the Environement protocol, we will use certainly what is the most updated methodology and not the old one.
Yes, it's related to the impact categories we are using, which are based on the work of the International Reference Lifecycle Data System, ILCD handbook, which in some categories we get the feedback might be seen as outdated, because it took us 3 to 5 years to get the things together. And of course, at some point you say, well, there have been new kids on the block. Even Pfister 2009 is not that new. So we have to define a maintenance and update cycle. We haven't done that yet. What is for sure is that there needs to be a balance between what sometimes we would like as well as a scientific research organization to always be at the cutting edge with some things, and the kind of providing a stable environment for industry and other stakeholders to do assessments. So that it will definitely cannot be the case that we update yearly something, because then everything changes yearly and you may need to have new emissions, you may have to inventory and those kind of things. So that definitely will not be our recommendation, but probably as well a cycle of 5 years will be too long. I'm pretty sure that after the end of the pilots, in the new, then revised PEF guide and OEF guide, there will be a reflection as well on the impact categories. I mean, I know it's not only water. What we know, we would like to look in at least is land use, is resources, and maybe updates as well on other impact categories which are dealt with in the FP7 project currently, or just about to finish LC Impact, because they have looked at all the impact categories as well. And then they came up with recommendations, either refining certain things in impact categories or completely redefining things, and we will look at that. And another development which is just about to kick off is on the international level from the UNEP CTEC Lifecycle Initiative. They as well have one of their flagships is in looking, reviewing different impact categories and different methods. And that hopefully will as well end roughly in 3 years if the timelines hold. So there will be a lot of more information coming out in 2-3 years. I would not necessarily expect a whole revision of the impact categories in the next year. Some maybe, but not everything.
Thank you very much for all your patience answering basically all the questions.